It was mid-autumn, the kind where daylight comes in thick amber strands, catching in the drifting pine needles. Claire was splitting kindling when she saw the movement at the edge of the clearing. A shape, low and fluid, stepped from shadow to shadow with the certainty of something born to own the space between light and dark. At first she thought coyote, but the tail was wrong, short, stubbed, ending in a black tip like a quill dipped in ink. Tufted ears swiveled toward her, holding still in a way that felt like assessment. The animal's coat, once it caught the sun, was tawny, overlaid with faint dark spots, as if some painter had brushed them in only to change their mind and leave the work unfinished. A bobcat. In these hills, they're ghosts, more often than their neighbors. Solitary, ranging over miles, they leave only tracks in snow or the remains of a rabbit where the underbrush thins. And here one stood, reclined, on the damp carpet of pine duff, settling its weight on four legs with the slow satisfaction of someone choosing the best seat in the house. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of wet bark and the metallic tang of the creek. Claire's breath rose in small white curls, and she found her hands tightening on the maul without meaning to. The bobcat didn't move, only narrowed its amber eyes. Not in threat, more like a dealer across a card table, waiting for her to play. Claire knew enough about wildlife to understand how rare it was for a bobcat to show itself like this. They could leap 10 feet from a standstill, clear a fence without touching it, and vanish into cover in the space of a blink. This one stayed put. And in that stillness, she caught something she couldn't name, a thread of expectation. The air was cold enough to bite the edges of her fingers, even through her gloves. She was aware of every sound. The gentle tink of ice loosening from a branch, the soft crackle of a log shifting in the woodpile, the measured inhale of the animal across from her. In that moment, the world contracted to a span of 20 paces. Claire didn't step forward, and the bobcat didn't retreat. They simply regarded each other, two creatures with their own reasons for avoiding closeness. She could almost feel the echo of her own guardedness in its stillness, the way grief had taught her to ration warmth like winter firewood, giving it only where it wouldn't burn her again. A gust of wind pushed through the clearing, rattling the dry aspen leaves that clung stubbornly to their branches. The bobcat's ear twitched toward the sound, then back to her. Claire thought of the wildlife books she used to keep by the drafting table, the notes she'd once made about this species' hunting habits. Crepuscular activity, ambush predator, fiercely territorial. She also remembered that they sometimes stayed near human dwellings in lean years, not from tameness, but from calculation. The animal shifted its weight, the muscles in its shoulders rolling under the coat like water under ice. Then it lowered itself onto its belly, paws crossed neatly, an oddly domestic gesture for something so wild. Claire let the maul rest against the stump. She didn't speak. Words felt like they would break whatever this was. Instead, she watched, and was watched in return, until the light began to drain from the sky and the shadows thickened between them. When she finally turned to go inside, she resisted the urge to glance back. Something in her, a thing she'd thought long buried, knew that if she looked, and the bobcat was still there, it would be the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready to begin. Inside, the kettle whistled. Outside, the clearing was quiet again, but the air in the room felt different, as if she'd left the door open just long enough for a pie of the wild to slip in unnoticed. Morning in the foothills arrives, not with the sudden blaze of desert sunrise, but with a gradual lifting of the dark. First, a dim blueness that seeps between the pines, rendering the frost on their needles into silver threads. Then, the low hum of waking things, the creek muttering under a thin skin of ice, a jay's impatient screech, the distant knock of a woodpecker against hollow bark. Claire had lived here long enough to know that mornings carry the truth of a place. Nights can hide things, afternoons can distract with their brightness, but morning light angled and unhurried, shows what's been there all along. That day it revealed the clearing with a clarity so sharp it seemed the air had been polished overnight. Her cabin sat at the clearing's northern edge, facing south toward a slope where the ponderosas thinned into patches of manzanita. The ground was a patchwork of pine duff, stones smoothed by seasonal snowmelt, and pockets of brittle grass. Each winter, the deer wore narrow tracks into the earth on their way to the creek, and each spring, wild iris rose in quiet clumps near the waterline. She stepped outside with her coffee, the steam curling in the cold. The air smelled of damp soil and smoke from a neighbor's wood stove a mile down the road. Across the clearing, the sun's first fingers touched the tips of the manzanita, turning their red bark almost luminous. The bobcat was not in sight. She didn't expect it to be, not yet. Still, she let her eyes trace the same shadows where she'd seen it before. The stillness out there was layered, the stillness of frost holding the ground, of pine branches too heavy to sway, and of an absence that was somehow charged, as though the clearing itself waited for a cue. This place had always felt alive to her, even before yesterday's meeting. Wind patterns here seemed to change with the hour. In summer, the slope's heat drew, in cooler air from the north, carrying the sharp scent of sage. In winter, the cold came low and settled like a held breath, sometimes for days until a storm shouldered through from the west. That morning, the temperature hovered just below freezing. She could feel it in the way the boards of the porch seemed to leach heat from her slippers. Her breath joined the slow drift of steam from the mug, both vanishing in the same still air. Somewhere unseen, a squirrel barked, a staccato warning. Not for her. She scanned the slope again, her gaze adjusting to the mottled pattern of rock and brush. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement low to the ground, just enough to break the symmetry. The bobcat stepped into view, as if materializing from the color of the earth itself. It moved with the precision of its species, muscles coiled under its frame, each step deliberate. The short tail twitched once, a punctuation mark, before it paused beside a granite boulder streaked with lichen. Its breath condensed faintly in the air, and Claire realized she was holding her own. She knew bobcats could cover several miles in a day, their range expanding in winter as they hunted for rabbits, squirrels, even the occasional bird. They relied on stealth, their padded paws allowing them to cross snow and leaf litter without a sound. And yet, here was one in the open, at an hour when the frost still held its grip. The cat's gaze swept the clearing, not hurriedly, but with a casual thoroughness, as though confirming that the landscape remained in proper order. Its ears pivoted toward a sound she couldn't hear, then flattened slightly before lifting again. Every movement was a sentence in a language she only half understood, but wanted to learn. Claire sipped her coffee slowly, letting the heat anchor her against the cold. She didn't call out, didn't try to bridge the space. This was the clearing's time, and she was content to be a guest in it. The bobcat moved on, tracing the same route she'd seen deer take toward the creek. When it reached the edge of the slope, it stopped and lowered its head. She imagined it listening, not just for prey, but for the myriad small truths that morning air carries, the tremor of a vole beneath snow, the wing beat of a jay overhead, the shift of ice on the water's skin. Minutes passed. Then, with a bound so smooth it seemed premeditated, it disappeared into the manzanita. The clearing exhaled, its tension easing into the ordinary noises of day. Claire lingered outside until her coffee cooled. The frost began to soften under the sun's reach, and drops formed at the tips of pine needles, each catching a fragment of the world in its curve. She thought about how presence could be felt even after departure, how some absences are shaped not by emptiness, but by the memory of what stood there a moment before. By the third morning, Claire understood that the bobcat was not simply passing through. There was intention in the way it appeared, as if the clearing were a stage and she a member of its silent audience. This time, the first light had barely cleared the ridge when she spotted the animal perched on a fallen ponderosa, its body curved along the trunk like liquid fur and bone. From a distance, the bobcat looked smaller than she'd imagined, 3 feet from nose to tail, perhaps 30 pounds at most, but there was nothing diminished about her presence. The tufted ears were like crowns, black-tipped and alert, swiveling independently to track the hidden music of the forest. Her coat carried the muted palette of the land itself, tawny, dusted with gray along the spine, overlaid with faint rosettes that vanished when she moved. In stillness, she was part of the landscape. In motion, she was the reason the landscape existed. Claire knew enough about the species to recognize these markings as camouflage, designed for the dappled edges where light and shadow blur. Bobcats hunt mostly at dawn and dusk, using patience as their primary weapon. They can wait for hours, unmoving, before exploding into a burst of speed that leaves little chance for their prey. But this one, this queen of the clearing, seemed to be in no hurry to hunt. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from her stove, mingled with the resin of sun-warmed pine. Frost clung to the underside of the log where the bobcat reclined, tiny crystals that caught the light and made a halo beneath her belly. When she exhaled, the vapor drifted sideways on a breeze too slight to move the surrounding grass. From where she stood on the porch, Claire could see the delicate rise and fall of the animal's rib cage. There was no visible injury, no limp, but there was a leanness to her frame, a sharpness along the haunches that told a quieter story. Winter was a lean season for all predators, and in these hills, the competition for rabbits and squirrels was fierce. Yet even in hunger, the bobcat's bearing was unshaken. She stretched forward, forelegs extending in a languid arc, claws flexing into the bark. Then she yawned, an unhurried, cavernous thing that showed the pale pink of her mouth and the curved precision of her teeth. It was a gesture so domestic in appearance that for a moment Claire could have mistaken her for a house cat, albeit one who had wandered in from the pages of a wild folk tale. She wondered what the world looked like from that vantage point, how scents must paint the air in invisible color, how each flicker of movement told a different story. Did the bobcat notice the steam from her coffee, the faint hum of the cabin's refrigerator through the wall, the shift of her weight on the porch boards? A breeze stirred the pine canopy, and sunlight shifted across the clearing. The bobcat turned her head, and their eyes met across the space. Amber, flecked with darker rings around the iris, they were eyes that seemed to measure rather than simply see. There was no fear in them, only a level acknowledgement, two solitary creatures recognizing the boundary they shared. Claire found herself holding still, almost mimicking the bobcat's stillness, as if any sudden motion would break the fragile thread between them. She thought of the canvases stacked in her studio, half-finished portraits of animals she had once studied in detail, the sweep of a fox's tail, the layered feathers of an owl. But she had never painted a bobcat, never even sketched one from life. She realized, with a kind of muted astonishment, that this was the first time in months she had really looked at something with an artist's eye. The bobcat shifted, lifting her chin to test the air. Her whiskers, long and white, flared slightly forward, a sign, Claire recalled, that a feline's attention had sharpened. A jay shrieked somewhere to the east, and the bobcat's ears swiveled toward the sound. For a moment, Claire thought she might leap from the log and vanish into the manzanita. Instead, the animal lay back down, curling her paws beneath her chest in the posture of one who intends to stay a while. The muscles under her coat rippled once as she resettled, and then she blinked slowly, once, twice, in Claire's direction. It was such a small thing, that blink. But Claire knew enough about feline language to read it for what it was. Not submission, not even friendliness, but the absence of threat. A mutual understanding that neither would harm the other. A squirrel scurried along the base of the log, chattering in irritation before darting out of sight. The bobcat's tail tip twitched once, but she made no move to give chase. Instead, she lowered her head onto her paws, her eyes narrowing to slits in the rising sunlight. Claire stayed where she was, coffee cooling in her hands, and allowed the moment to stretch. The cabin behind her seemed to fade, and the only world that mattered was this patch of earth, this slant of light, this unlikely companionship held in silence. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the faintest shift, the awareness that a door she'd kept locked might be nudging open, not with force, but with the quiet insistence of something that simply refuses to leave. The weather turned in the night. By morning, a thin crust of ice rimmed the creek, and frost lay thick enough on the grass to crunch beneath a boot. The sky had that pale, brittle quality that warns of snow without yet delivering it. The clearing looked the same at first glance. Pines unmoving, manzanita dark against the slope. But the air carried a sharper stillness, a kind that makes sound travel farther and time feel slower. Claire stepped outside, mug in hand, scanning the familiar edges. It took a moment to spot her. The bobcat was there, crouched low near the granite boulder halfway across the clearing, her coat blending so well into the mottled stone that only the faint lift of her breath betrayed her presence. Something about her posture was different. The regal ease of the previous morning had been replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. The muscles along her back were drawn tight, the fur over her ribs lifted slightly by the rise and fall of her breathing. Claire had seen that look in animals before, not fear exactly, but the drawn line of endurance. She remembered reading that in winter, even skilled hunters like bobcats can fail more often than they succeed. Rabbits burrow deeper, birds are flightier, and the snow muffles the sound of prey until it's too late to pounce. A bobcat can go days without a meal, living on stored fat, but the cost shows quickly, the hollowing of the flanks, the sharper jut of bone under the pelt. When the cat shifted, Claire caught a clearer view. The left hind leg didn't plant cleanly. Instead, it touched down with a fat raction, less weight before lifting again. Not a full limp, but enough to slow her. Injuries in the wild often come from the smallest missteps, an awkward landing, a hidden branch under snow. Even a strain could be costly here. The bobcat's head turned toward the creek, ears pricked forward. For a moment she seemed to debate whether to move. Then, with a slow deliberation, she eased forward, each step placed as if the ground might betray her. She paused halfway, crouched again, and waited. Claire followed her gaze to a patch of open ground where a pair of juncos pecked at the frost for seeds. The bird hunt was half-hearted. The bobcat made a low, silent advance, but when the juncos startled and flitted into the brush, she didn't give chase. Instead, she sat back on her haunches, tail tip flicking once before going still again. It was the stillness that caught Claire's breath, not the practiced patience of a predator lying in wait, but the pause of something weighing its energy against its need. From the porch, Claire felt an ache that had nothing to do with the cold. She knew this kind of calculation too well. After her husband's death, she had learned the mathematics of survival, how to ration the energy for phone calls, for errands, for conversations with neighbors. Some days she'd done the minimum and let the rest go because moving through the world at full speed had felt impossible. The bobcat moved toward the creek at last, limping slightly more with each step. She paused at the bank, lowering her head to drink from a narrow channel where the water still ran free under the ice. Steam rose faintly from the surface, blurring her reflection. Claire sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her against the sting in her chest. There was nothing she could do, not yet. To approach would only push the animal farther, waste her energy, maybe worsen whatever strained that leg. In the wild, interference could mean the difference between adapting and becoming dependent, between survival and something more fragile. A raven called from the far slope, its voice deep and resonant in the cold air. The bobcat's ears twitched toward the sound, then back toward the clearing. For a moment, she stood with the water's edge at her paws, her breath making small clouds in the stillness. Then she turned away from the creek, moving into the shadows beneath the pines where frost lingered longest. Claire watched until she disappeared from sight, her tawny coat swallowed by the undergrowth. The clearing seemed to grow larger in her absence, emptier in a way it hadn't felt before they'd crossed paths. She stood on the porch long after the coffee had gone cold, scanning the frost-marked grass for the faint indentations left behind, tracks pressed just deep enough to tell the story of where she'd been and how carefully she'd chosen each step. Somewhere in those shallow prints, Claire felt the echo of her own careful steps through the past 2 years. The bobcat had her own reasons for conserving energy, for watching more than acting, for enduring more than chasing. Different worlds, same equation. Spend only what you can afford and trust that the season will turn in your favor. The wind shifted, bringing the faint scent of snow. Claire stepped inside, setting her mug down without rinsing it, and leaned against the counter. Through the window, the clearing lay quiet again, but she knew better now. Quiet was not the absence of struggle. It was the sound of it being carried in silence. From the cabin's south-facing window, Claire could see almost the entire sweep of the clearing. She had learned the view by heart over the past 2 years, every curve of the slope, every stubborn patch of manzanita that refused to yield to winter storms. But lately, her gaze kept straying to the granite boulder halfway down, and the one that now carried the memory of a tawny shadow crouched low against the frost. It was mid-morning, the sun filtering through high clouds that dulled its warmth but made the air luminous. Claire stood with one hand wrapped around a mug, not for the coffee, it had gone lukewarm, but for the heat still seeping from the ceramic. The bobcat had not appeared today. She told herself this was normal, that wild animals don't keep schedules for human convenience, but there was an odd restlessness in her chest. She'd lived here alone since Mark died. 2 years and a scattering of days, enough time for the grief to lose its raw edge, but not enough to forget the way the world had shifted overnight. Mark had been the one who filled the silence. His laugh had a way of pulling the cold from a room. He'd been the one to coax her into the studio when she doubted her work, to drive them down the winding road into town for groceries they didn't strictly need, just for the chance to walk together. Since his absence, she'd kept the studio door closed more often than not. Brushes sat in jars clouded with dust. Half-finished canvases leaned against the wall in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for a hand that hadn't found the will to lift a brush again. She told herself she'd return when the right subject arrived, but the truth was, she had been avoiding the kind of attention painting required, the careful act of seeing. The bobcat had disrupted that without permission. In 3 brief encounters, she had drawn Claire's focus outward, forcing her to study the angles of her shoulders, the flick of her ears, the shadows that shifted along her coat when the wind moved the pines. A creak from the porch pulled her from her thoughts. It was only the boards shifting in the cold, but instinct made her glance toward the door. She remembered the first time she'd seen those tufted ears against the boulder, and how something in her, something she'd been guarding, had responded, not with pity, not with fear, but with a quiet, unbidden pull. Claire had grown up here, in a part of Arizona where the nearest neighbor might be half a mile away, and wildlife wasn't spectacle, but fact. She'd learned to tell the seasons by what came to the yard: javelina in winter, black-headed grosbeaks in spring, the occasional black bear nosing at the compost pile before retreating to the tree line. Bobcats were the rarest visitors, and they never lingered. That this one did felt significant in a way she wasn't ready to name. She thought about the rules she'd been taught early on. Don't feed wild predators. Don't try to tame them. Don't mistake curiosity for friendliness. Respect the distance. Let them remain what they are. It was good advice, necessary advice. And yet, as she glanced toward the tree line, she felt the tug of something less practical, a desire not just to see, but to understand. The kettle began to rattle on the stove, steam hissing from its spout. She turned the flame low, letting the sound fill the cabin. Through the window, a light snow had begun, the flakes falling straight down in the still air. They settled on the manzanita, softened the edges of the boulder, blurred the clearing into a muted palette of gray and white. Her phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID read, "Ellen." Claire hesitated, then answered. "You've been quiet lately," Ellen's voice said after the greeting, warm but edged with concern. "I was thinking of coming up this weekend." Claire imagined Ellen in her small house in town, the one lined with books and plants, always ready with tea and conversation. They'd been friends for years, but since Mark's death, Claire had let the visits dwindle. "Maybe," she said, unsure. "Weather might get in the way." "Or maybe it's time you had company," Ellen replied gently. "You sound distracted." Claire glanced toward the clearing again. "You've been watching something," she said, realizing how odd it would sound. "A bobcat. She's been hanging around." "That's unusual," Ellen said. "Be careful." There was a pause, then, "You're not thinking of—" "I'm just watching," Claire interrupted, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince her friend or herself. They spoke a little longer, about the snow, about groceries, about nothing important. After hanging up, Claire stood at the window until the call's echo faded from her thoughts. The snow was heavier now, the boulder gone from sight. The clearing had closed its curtain for the day. She wondered where the bobcat sheltered in weather like this, whether she curled herself into some hollow under the manzanita, tucking her paws beneath her, eyes half closed against the cold. The thought lodged itself in Claire's mind as she poured fresh hot water into her mug. She didn't realize she was smiling until the steam rose and blurred her reflection in the glass. The storm came in heavier than forecast. By morning, the world beyond Claire's porch had been remade. Branches bowed under thick white weight, the creek buried beneath a seamless blanket, its presence marked only by a faint depression winding toward the tree line. The air was so still that sound seemed reluctant to travel, as if the snow had muffled more than just the ground. Claire stepped outside, boots sinking with a soft woof. The temperature bit instantly at her cheeks, the kind of dry cold that sharpened breath into visible shapes. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the clearing. The granite boulder was a smooth mound now, its edges softened, and every familiar landmark wore a new outline. Then she saw them. Tracks. Not deer, whose hooves left sharp heart-shaped prints. Not rabbit, whose leaps stitched the snow in uneven patterns. These were rounded, with the faint impression of pads and no claw marks, each about 2 inches wide. Bobcat. The trail came from the east, crossing the slope at a diagonal, and curved toward the boulder. The prints were deep enough to show she'd moved at an unhurried pace. Claire followed them with her eyes until they vanished into the manzanita at the clearing's far edge. She felt a small, surprising relief that the storm hadn't driven the animal from her range. The snow underfoot creaked as she stepped down, careful not to disturb the tracks. She'd read once that bobcats often use the same routes repeatedly, choosing paths that allow them to stay hidden until they want to be seen. That thought lingered as she reached the boulder and found more prints circling it, evidence of a pause, maybe a moment of listening. She crouched, brushing a gloved hand near the indentations. Even through the barrier of leather, she imagined the weight behind each step, the compact strength of muscles built for short bursts, the precision of paws designed to spread weight evenly over soft ground. This was the closest she'd been to the bobcat without actually seeing her. The wind shifted, carrying the faint resin scent of the pines mixed with something sharper, distant wood smoke, perhaps from a neighbor's chimney. Claire straightened and scanned the slope again. A flicker of movement caught her eye between 2 snow-heavy branches far to the right. There she was. The bobcat stood half in shadow, half in light, her coat blending so perfectly with the patchwork of snow and bark that Claire might have missed her if not for the ears, those black-tipped triangles, turning like fine instruments to catch the smallest sound. They watched each other across the distance. The space between them seemed drawn tight as a wire, humming with something neither could name. The bobcat's eyes were the same amber she remembered, but in the whitewashed light of morning they seemed to hold more gold than fire. Claire stayed still, not out of fear but respect. She knew the rules here. Movement must be measured, intentions clear. The bobcat shifted her weight, stepping forward a single pace before stopping again. It was a near miss of contact, an acknowledgement without commitment. The snow around them absorbed all sound except the faint rustle of a jay somewhere overhead. Claire's breath rose in front of her, and for a moment she wondered if the animal could see it, measure it the way predators measure wind direction and distance. A flurry shook loose from the branch above the bobcat, falling in a soft cascade that speckled her coat. She shook once, a ripple passing from head to tail, then turned away, padding back toward the manzanita. Her print stitched a clean line through the snow, deliberate and unbroken, until the undergrowth swallowed her. Claire exhaled slowly. She felt the faintest sting of disappointment, but it was tempered by something quieter. Anticipation. Encounters like this were not about instant closeness. They were about learning the shape of the distance, respecting it until it changed on its own. She walked back to the cabin, careful to keep her steps outside the bobcat's trail. Inside, the window framed the clearing like a living painting. The untouched snow seemed to glow in the muted light, the tracks a script written in a language she was beginning to understand. Some part of her recognized that these moments, half-seen movements, cautious glances, silent agreements, were building toward something neither of them could yet predict. The first contact wasn't in the touch, it was in the awareness, in the choosing to be visible at all. As the day wore on, clouds began to gather again over the ridge, softening the edges of the world. Claire kept glancing out the window, not for movement, but for that particular stillness that preceded it. She had learned now, too, that the bobcat's presence was less about the moment she appeared and more about the space she occupied in between. By late afternoon, the light had thinned to the pale silver of approaching snow. Claire stood at the porch railing, hands wrapped around a mug, and let the cold settle into her lungs. Somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, the bobcat was watching her, or perhaps not watching at all, but the possibility was enough. The next morning broke in shades of pearl and soft gray, the kind of light that seemed to erase the edges of things. Overnight, the storm had left another shallow layer of snow, barely 2 inches, just enough to cover the older tracks and turn the clearing into a clean canvas. The air was windless, holding a fragile balance that could shatter with the smallest disturbance. Claire stepped out onto the porch with her coffee, the boards under her boots groaning faintly. Her breath curled into the air, hanging there before dissolving. She stood still for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, the way a painter would step back from a canvas to take in the whole scene. At first, there was nothing, just the muted shapes of pines, the slope falling away into its patchwork of snow and manzanita, the faint shimmer where ice had sealed the creek. Then a shape appeared at the far edge of the clearing, materializing as though the snow itself had decided to shift. The bobcat moved with the unhurried grace of something entirely at home in its own skin. Her coat was dusted with snow along the spine, her paws lifting and placing with the precision of a seamstress threading a needle. She left no waste in her movement, no unnecessary gesture. Claire noticed the limp again, slight but present, and felt that quiet twist of concern. When the cat reached the granite boulder, she didn't skirt it as before. Instead, she leapt, a single coiled spring of muscle and landing lightly atop the mound where snow flattened under her weight. She sat there, tall and balanced, the short tail curling like punctuation behind her. From this vantage, she had a full view of the clearing and of Claire. They looked at each other across the space. No movement, no sound. The stillness between them seemed to hum, not with tension, but with the rare quality of being acknowledged without demand. Claire didn't shift her stance, didn't raise the mug to her lips. She simply stood, letting the cold bite at her cheeks, letting the moment stretch. A magpie winged overhead, its black and white form stark against the pale sky, calling once before disappearing into the pines. The bobcat's ears swiveled toward the sound, then returned to face Claire. It was the kind of attention that felt deliberate, as if she were deciding not just what she saw, but how she wanted to see it. In that gaze, Claire felt something shift, not in the animal, but in herself. For months, maybe years, she'd been moving through her days without offering that kind of full regard to anything. She'd noticed things, yes, light on snow, the curve of a branch, but she hadn't met them. Now, here was this wild, self-possessed creature meeting her without pretense. The bobcat blinked, slow and deliberate. Claire recognized it from her knowledge of feline behavior, a sign of ease, an unspoken message that said, "I'm not here to harm you." She felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, something that had been dormant stirring awake. The snow under the boulder's ledge slipped with a faint shh, and the bobcat shifted slightly to keep her footing. She looked down at the movement, then back at Claire, as if to confirm the world was still in its proper order. The limp hadn't stopped her from taking the high ground. There was dignity in that, an insistence on being more than what her injury suggested. They stayed like that for what might have been minutes, though time felt suspended. Claire became aware of every small detail: the faint vapor of the cat's breath in, the cold air, the subtle twitch of her whiskers when the breeze shifted, the way the light caught the fine guard hairs along her cheek. She imagined that the bobcat was collecting her details in the same way: the color of her jacket, the stillness of her hands, the scent of coffee rising in faint spirals. When the cat finally moved, it was not to leave. She stepped down from the boulder with a smooth descent, crossed a few paces closer, and sat again, still well beyond the invisible line that separated them, but undeniably nearer. Claire's breath hitched, not in fear, but in the recognition that this was a choice. The bobcat's eyes softened, the amber seeming to take in more light than they gave back. Claire realized she was smiling. Small, unforced, the kind of smile that came not from amusement, but from relief. The distance between them remained, but it felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Eventually the cat stood, turning toward the slope, and walked away without haste. Claire didn't call out, didn't step forward. She let her go, knowing that what had passed between them didn't need to be chased. When the clearing was empty again, Claire stayed on the porch a little longer, the coffee cooling in her hands. The stillness remained, but it had changed. Now it was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something unseen, a thread running quietly between two solitary lives. The limp was more pronounced the next day. Claire spotted it as soon as the bobcat emerged from the tree line, an almost imperceptible hitch in her left hind leg, the briefest hesitation before each step. It wasn't slowing her enough to threaten her survival yet, but it was there, and it was growing harder to ignore. The sky had cleared overnight, leaving the air crisp and sharp-edged. Sunlight spilled over the ridge in long golden bands, striking the snow until it glittered like powdered glass. The clearing was quiet, except for the faint ticking of melting ice sliding from the branches. Claire stood at the edge of the porch, her hands resting on the railing, watching as the bobcat threaded her way toward the granite boulder. She moved slower now, though she tried to mask it with the same deliberate grace. Every step was measured, her paws pressing small, perfect impressions into the snow. When she reached the boulder, she sat instead of leaping atop it. Her ears swiveled toward the forest behind her, then back toward Claire. The space between them felt like a scale, delicately balanced, neither inviting nor rejecting. Claire's mind flickered to the rules she'd been raised with, unwritten laws of living in this place. You didn't interfere with wild animals unless absolutely necessary. Nature had its own systems, its own brutal efficiencies. Sometimes, stepping in did more harm than good. But another thought pressed in, heavier. The injury was mild now, but what if it worsened? What if a failed hunt or a deep snow made her weaker? The calculus was different here than in summer. A healthy bobcat could roam miles for prey, but a hungry, injured one might not survive the lean months. The question wasn't just should she intervene, it was could she, without altering the very thing she admired in this animal. There was a dignity in her independence, in the way she chose when and how to appear. Offering help could mean crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Claire thought of Mark then, of the way he used to say that trust wasn't something you built with big gestures. It was in the quiet, consistent choices. He'd been the kind of man who mended small tears in the fabric of daily life before they could unravel into something larger. He would have asked her what she was willing to risk for the sake of doing something instead of nothing. A movement at the corner of her vision pulled her back. The bobcat had turned toward the slope, lowering her head to sniff at the snow. Her whiskers trembled as she investigated, likely catching the scent of a vole or mouse beneath the crust. She crouched, shoulders tensing, then sprang forward with the precision of her kind. It wasn't a clean strike. The crust broke unevenly under her weight, and she landed off balance. She still managed to come up with something small between her teeth, but the effort had cost her. Claire could see it in the way she paused afterward, favoring the hind leg more than before. The sight settled in Claire's chest like a stone. She wrapped her hands tighter around the porch railing, feeling the cold bite into her skin through the gloves. This was the moment the choice began to take shape, not a sudden decision, but the slow forming of intent. She could leave it to nature, let the bobcat navigate her world with the tools she'd been given. That was the purest, cleanest option, the one that wouldn't risk dependency. But it was also the option that meant standing by while an animal she had come to know, however distantly, might struggle needlessly. There were other paths. She could leave food at the edge of the clearing, not near enough to make her tame, but close enough to offer a buffer against hunger. She could observe more closely, keep track of the limp, see if it worsened. She could call in someone with wildlife expertise, though the thought of strangers in the clearing made her recoil. As the bobcat finished her small meal, she looked up, snow clinging to the fur around her muzzle. Her eyes met Claire's across the white expanse, unblinking. There was no way to know what, if anything, she saw in the human on the porch, but Claire felt as if she'd been asked a question. The bobcat turned and vanished into the manzanita, her tracks cutting a sharp line through the snow. Claire stayed on the porch long after, weighing the two truths she now held, that the wild should remain wild, and that sometimes doing nothing was its own kind of interference. By the time the sun had shifted past the ridge, she knew she was leaning toward action. The question that remained was how to act without breaking the fragile, wordless agreement they had built. The next morning, Claire rose before the light had cleared the ridge. She moved through the cabin in quiet, the way one does when preparing for something that feels like a test. Outside, the snow had crusted overnight, sparkling under the thin blush of dawn. The cold was sharper than it had been all week, the kind that pricks at exposed skin like 1,000 needles. She had decided, after hours of turning it over in her mind, to leave food, but on the bobcat's terms, not hers. A length of venison she'd frozen last season, wrapped in brown paper and tucked into the far corner of the freezer. It wasn't the sort of thing one gave away lightly. Mark had hunted it himself the year before he died, one of the last trips they'd taken together. But it felt right somehow, offering something born of the same landscape the bobcat called home. Claire carried it to the porch in a canvas sack, her breath steaming into the brittle air. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the clearing. No movement. Good. She didn't want her first gesture to feel like an ambush. She'd chosen a spot halfway between the cabin and the boulder, close enough for her to watch from the window, far enough to keep the invisible line of trust intact. The snow crunched under her boots as she walked out, each step loud in the morning hush. She knelt, placing the bundle on the ground, unwrapping it just enough for the scent to carry. The meat was still firm with frost, the rich smell muted but present. She backed away slowly, her boots retracing their own prints, careful not to make a new path that might seem like pursuit. Back inside, she stood at the window, coffee cooling in her hands. The clearing remained empty for nearly an hour. Jays squabbled in the pines. A squirrel ventured toward the parcel, sniffed, and darted away, as if sensing it wasn't meant for him. Then, movement. The bobcat emerged from the tree line with the same quiet inevitability she always had, her paws barely denting the snow. She was alert, ears pivoting toward every sound, but her gaze kept returning to the shape in the snow. Claire watched her stop, head lifting to scent the air. The wind was in her favor. The smell would reach the cat before the sight did. The approach was slow, a measured advance that spoke of both curiosity and caution. When she reached the halfway mark, she paused, scanning the cabin as though aware she was being watched. Her eyes found Claire's, and for a moment, they held each other across the distance. Then, with a kind of deliberate indifference, the bobcat moved to the offering. She sniffed, circled once, and sat, not eating yet, just claiming space around it, as if to announce that she'd accepted the gift on her own terms. After a pause long enough for frost to settle on her whiskers, she bent her head and began to eat. Claire noticed the limp was still there, though less pronounced than yesterday. She wondered if the warmth of movement was easing the strain, or if the small vole from the day before had been enough to buy a little strength. Watching her now, the muscles in her shoulders moving in a rhythm older than anything Claire could name, she felt both relief and an unexpected pang, because this was the first time their connection had been tied to an exchange. Halfway through the meat, the bobcat stopped, lifted her head, and licked her muzzle clean. She didn't look toward the trees or the boulder, but directly at Claire's window. It wasn't a glare, nor gratitude, just an unblinking acknowledgement, as if to say, "I know where this came from." Then, just as deliberately as she'd approached, she left. The remainder of the food stayed behind, a dark shape against the snow. Claire resisted the urge to go out and move it closer. It belonged to the clearing now, to the rhythm the bobcat chose for herself. The rest of the day passed in a strange quiet. The patch of snow where the food lay drew visitors, a pair of ravens, a cautious fox who skirted too close and was chased off in a flurry of wings and growls when the bobcat returned later. By nightfall, the offering was gone. That evening, Claire sat at the kitchen table, sketchbook open for the first time in months. She didn't draw the bobcat's face, not yet, but the curve of her spine as she stepped toward the gift, the print of her paw in snow beside the venison, the stillness of that gaze through the glass. This was no act of taming. It was a negotiation conducted without words, in the language of space and choice. And as much as Claire had chosen to act, she understood now that the real choice belonged to the one who had taken the meat, looked back once, and then walked away. The first hints of spring came early that year, arriving as a trickle rather than a rush. The snowpack began to recede from the base of the pines, revealing damp earth that smelled faintly of rot and life in equal measure. In the mornings, the frost still clung to the edges of the clearing, but by afternoon the light was warm enough to send rivulets of water racing down the slope toward the creek. Claire noticed the change not just in the land but in the bobcat. The limp that had once been a cautious hitch was now almost gone, smoothed out by time and by whatever subtle strengthening had taken place in the weeks since she had begun leaving food. The cat moved with a looser, more fluid grace again, the tautness of winter survival softening into something closer to ease. Yet the attitude, if it could be called that, remained. The bobcat still came and went on her own schedule, ignoring food if it was offered too close to the porch, or disappearing entirely for days as if to remind Claire she belonged to no one. When she did appear, it was often with a show of studied disinterest, pausing on the boulder to wash a paw or blink lazily at the sunlight before acknowledging Claire's presence at all. One afternoon, Claire was on the porch, sanding the frame of a canvas, when she saw movement at the edge of her vision. The bobcat emerged from the tree line with the unhurried stride of someone who knew they were being watched and had decided to make the most of it. Her coat, now shedding its dense winter underlayer, caught the light in a way that brought out the muted gold beneath the tawny. Claire set the sander down, wiping her hands on her jeans. She had learned by now that meeting the cat's gaze too quickly could be read as a challenge, so she let her eyes wander over the slope before settling back on her. The bobcat stopped a few paces from the granite boulder, tail-tip twitching. They regarded each other in silence for several beats. Then, in a move that felt almost theatrical, the bobcat padded to the patch of sun-warmed earth in front of the boulder and flopped onto her side, stretching long and rolling onto her back. Her paws curled in the air for a moment before she twisted back upright, shaking out her coat with brisk efficiency. It was unmistakably a performance. Claire couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "You know exactly what you're doing," she murmured, though her voice didn't carry far in the still air. The bobcat's ears flicked once, but she didn't move closer, only sat with the composure of someone who had made her point and would accept no commentary on it. These visits had become something of a comedy in miniature, Claire offering jest. "Yours of welcome," the bobcat responding with alternating warmth and imperiousness. Once, when Claire had left a scrap of venison at the clearing's edge, the cat had approached, sniffed, and then, rather than eat, sat beside it for nearly half an hour before walking away, leaving it for the ravens. Another time, she'd appeared at the boulder, glanced toward the porch, and yawned so extravagantly that Claire had nearly dropped her mug in surprise. But beneath the humor was something sturdier, something that felt like trust, even if it was measured in inches rather than miles. The bobcat no longer skirted the clearing's perimeter. She would sometimes cross directly in front of the porch, her head level, her stride even. If Claire was working outside, she would pause, not to be touched or fed, but simply to look, to mark that she had seen her before moving on. The thaw brought other changes too. Songbirds returned, their calls carrying bright threads through the air. The creek swelled with snowmelt, its voice louder and more insistent. One morning, Claire woke to find fresh tracks crisscrossing the clearing, deer, fox, and the round, deliberate prints of the bobcat layered over them like a signature. Inside the cabin, the studio began to open again. She found herself cleaning brushes, unsticking the lids of paint jars, pulling a half-finished canvas from where it had been leaning in shadow. Without fully deciding to, she began sketching the arc of a feline spine, the tilt of tufted ears, the particular set of shoulders that marked the bobcat's posture when she stood on the boulder. It was not a portrait, not yet, more a study of movement, of presence, of the way something wild could inhabit a space without claiming it, and in doing so, change it entirely. That evening, as the sun sank and the air cooled, Claire stood at the porch rail with a cup of tea. The bobcat appeared from the slope, crossed the clearing, and stopped at the base of the steps. She didn't. To come closer. She didn't need to. Claire lifted her mug slightly, an unspoken salute. The bobcat blinked, slow and deliberate, then turned and walked away into the trees. By mid-spring, the clearing had transformed. The last stubborn patches of snow clung only to the shaded bases of the pines, and the air carried the green, sweet scent of new growth. The creek ran high and fast, tumbling over stones polished by the melt. From her porch, Claire could hear it even when the wind was still, a constant undercurrent to the days, like a reminder that things were moving forward whether she marked them or not. The bobcat moved differently now. The limp that had once drawn Claire's worried attention was gone entirely. Her gait as smooth and balanced as water flowing downhill. Her coat had shifted to its sleeker warm-weather layer, the rosettes along her sides sharper, the tawny brighter under the sun. She was leaner, but in the way of something tuned for its world, muscle and instinct in perfect proportion. She came less often now, and never on a predictable schedule. Sometimes a week would pass without a sighting, and then she would appear without warning, poised at the edge of the clearing as if she'd never been gone. Each return carried the same quiet charge, the same awareness that these moments were not promised. One morning, Claire was painting in the studio when a flicker of movement caught her eye through the open door. She stepped into the porch's shadow, brush still in hand. The bobcat was crossing the clearing from west to east, her stride unhurried. She didn't look toward the cabin immediately, but as she passed the boulder, her head turned, and her eyes found Claire. It struck Claire then how different this gaze felt from their first meeting months ago. It wasn't the wary measuring of an unknown presence, nor was it the tentative calculation of whether to stay or go. Yet it was something steadier. A recognition, perhaps, that the space between them was known territory now. That recognition settled in Claire, too, in a place deeper than words. She realized she had stopped thinking of the bobcat as a visitor. The clearing was hers, yes, but it was also the cat's. They were not sharing it out of compromise, but out of a mutual acceptance that had grown slowly, like the root of a tree pushing into stone until it found a way through. The changes in herself were harder to name, but they were there. She was painting again, not just animals, but the land, the lines of the slope, the light caught in the creek's current, the way shadow pooled at the base of the boulder in late afternoon. She found herself taking walks down to the water, boots sinking into the soft new grass, eyes open for details she might have once overlooked. Even her evenings had shifted. She lingered outside longer, tea in hand, letting the air cool her skin as she listened for the faint rustle that might mean she wasn't alone. Ellen had noticed, too, on her last visit. "You've got more color in your face," she'd said, standing in the studio doorway while Claire worked, "and more paint on your hands." Claire had smiled, glancing down at the smear of ochre along her knuckle. "It feels good to be looking at things again," she'd replied, and realized it was the truth. The bobcat had a part in that, though it was hard to explain how. It wasn't about affection in the human sense, or about the satisfaction of helping an injured creature heal. It was about presence, hers and Claire's own, the way they'd both chosen, in small and careful increments, to remain visible to each other. One evening near dusk, Claire sat on the porch steps as the day folded into the blue-gray of twilight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and blooming serviceberry. A movement at the far edge of the clearing drew her eye. The bobcat, stepping from the trees with the fluidity of a shadow becoming sub-stance. She crossed the clearing without pause, came to the boulder, and leapt onto it in one clean motion. From there she looked down at Claire, their gazes meeting in the half-light. No sound passed between them, no shift in distance, yet the moment felt full, layered with everything that had come before. Claire didn't move. She let the stillness hold them both until the bobcat turned, leapt down, and disappeared into the slope. Long after she was gone, the air seemed to retain her shape, as if the clearing itself had been changed by her passing. Claire knew she had been changed too, not in some grand, sweeping way, but in the slow, steady reweaving of a life that had been frayed. Summer came softly to the foothills. The meadow grasses reached up past Claire's knees, bending under the weight of seed heads. The pines stood dark and resin-scented, their lower boughs heavy with the heat of long afternoons. The creek had quieted, its spring rush settling into a low, steady song. It had been 3 weeks since Claire last saw the bobcat. Long absences weren't unusual now that the seasons were generous, but this one felt different, an awareness that something was approaching its natural close. She told herself not to expect an ending. Wild things rarely give you that kind of symmetry, but a part of her still watched the edges of the clearing, the way she'd once scanned the sky for the first storm clouds of autumn. The evening she returned came with a wind that smelled faintly of rain. Claire was on the porch, a sketchbook open on her knees, pencil loose in her hand. The light was thin and gold, the kind that comes only in the last hour before sunset. It caught in the grasses, turned the creek to a ribbon of metal. A flicker of movement drew her eyes. At the far edge, where the manzanita met the trees, the bobcat stepped into view. Her coat was sleek, her stride sure, each mew skull moving like it had been carved for precision. She didn't linger at the tree line but crossed the clearing with the confidence of someone taking familiar ground for the last time. When she reached the granite boulder, she paused. The wind tugged at the fur along her spine, ruffling it in small waves. She looked at Claire, not a quick glance, but a steady, deliberate holding of the gaze. It was the same look from that first winter, but stripped now of the caution and calculation. Claire's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't speak. The bobcat held her there for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time. Then she turned, leapt down from the boulder, and padded toward the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. Halfway there, she stopped. The wind shifted, and for an instant the grasses bent in the same direction, opening a clear line between them. The bobcat looked back, just once. It wasn't a plea or a farewell. It was a confirmation, an acknowledgment of the strange, quiet bond they had shared through the lean months and the thaw. Then she slipped into the shadowed pines, her tail tipped the last thing visible before the green swallowed her. The clearing was still again, but it didn't feel empty. The shape of her presence lingered in the air, stitched into the land as surely as the paths deer would wear into the grass by autumn. Claire sat for a long time after, watching the space where the bobcat had vanished. She thought about how much had changed in the months between that first wary meeting and now, how both of them had kept their independence and yet, without fanfare, had made space for the other. It hadn't been about rescue in the traditional sense. It had been about showing up day after day in whatever form was possible. Inside, the studio smelled faintly of turpentine and pine. On the easel stood the beginnings of a painting, not of the bobcat herself, but of the clearing at dawn, the boulder in shadow, a hint of movement in the grass. It was the closest she could come to holding the feeling without pinning it down. The next morning, the clearing was empty, but Claire noticed a new print in the soft earth by the creek, a single clean impression of a paw, as if pressed there deliberately. She didn't know if the bobcat would return. She didn't need to. Some stories didn't require another chapter to be complete. If you've ever had an animal choose to share its world with you, even for a short time, subscribe now to join others who believe those moments leave marks you can't measure. Tell me in the comments what wild or unexpected creature has crossed your path and stayed in your memory.